Okay, let's get started. We're on chapter 8 here in your Geisler and Brooks text. However, I really want you to pay attention to what Peter Kraft has to say in his book, Socratic Logic, there in your recommended reading for this week. The reason I'm saying this is because we're about to start talking about induction. Obviously, this says introduction to induction. Now, I'm not going to spend quite as much time in this particular lecture on what your text, your Geisler and Brooks text, has to say about induction, so much as I want to spend time on a little background information in regards to induction. Because remember, we're working from, as we take this course in Aristotelian logic, we're working from the classical conception, the classical philosophical school of thought, in the details of our Aristotelian logic here. So, having said that, let me say a couple few things, and then I'll get back to that, and I think it'll make sense. So first, when we talk about introduction and induction, remember, deductive logic has to do with certain conclusions, meaning that you move from a general principle, some sort of general truth, down to picture an inverted triangle here. It goes down as the inverted triangle goes down to a very particular conclusion. You move from general to very particular type conclusions. And also the nature of these conclusions are necessary, meaning that if the premises are true, say your standard deductive, your categorical syllogism, your standard categorical deductive syllogism, the standard example being all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You see how that moves from a very general true observation that all men are mortal. Well, Socrates, he's one of those things, so therefore he must be also mortal. Now, again, if those premises are true, remember, the conclusion has to be true whether we like it or not. Now, of course, I should say just very quickly that deductive logic can also move from a general truth or general observation to another general observation. It doesn't necessarily have to move from general to particular. It can be from general or universal, I should say. That's actually a better word there, a universal type claim to another universal claim. However, it can't go the opposite. Deductive logic can't go from particular to universal. Now, this is what distinguishes it, for the most part, from inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is we're going to flip that triangle. So now, picture the triangle right side up. It's the way that you would normally picture a triangle. Wide base at the bottom, tip at the top. And so you're going to go from very particular conclusions to general conclusions. You're going to try to say, let's word it this way, you're going to try to take particular examples, examine those particular examples over and over and over, and then come to a very general, a universal type conclusion. Now, as you can see, or as you can tell, as you gather, that this is the reverse of deductive logic. Now, if deductive logic or deductive reasoning is supposed to take you from these particulars, these general or these universal observations or premises or propositions, and then get you down to a particular, and if those are certain, those conclusions are certain, granting the truthfulness of the premises there, then what type of conclusions will what type of conclusions will inductive reasoning give you? Inductive reasoning doesn't give you certain conclusions per se, it gives you probabilistic conclusions. So what's an example of this? And you may be a step ahead of me here. If you're sharp and you're a step ahead of me, we're gonna get to this point in a second if you're already there. But before we get there, let's do an example. So suppose that you see, this would be an example of inductive reasoning. Suppose that you see a white duck walk through your front door. And let's say you see another white duck walk through your front door. You see another white duck walk through the front door. Then your wife says, I bet another duck's going to walk through the door. It walks through the door, and of course, it's also a white duck. Now, say this just goes on for, say, an hour or two. Aside from asking, why in the world are white ducks walking through my front door? Aside from that, you would probably be willing to bet the next duck that walks through your door is also going to be white. Now, you've just seen 1,245 white ducks walk through the door. The 1,246th duck that walks through the door will be white for certain, correct? Well, no. Right? It could be the spotted duck. or the black duck or whatever the case may be. But it is most likely going to be white, seeing as how you have this backdrop of evidence that suggests this particular pattern. Now, of course, that's something of a trivial type example. And this is where I want to spend the bulk of our time here. And I'm going to touch on some things in the text here, of course. But I want to spend probably the bulk of our time here in discussing the problem that you may have already seen. Now, and this is what I was making reference to when I said that you may be a step ahead of me. If deductive reasoning leads to certain conclusions, but inductive arguments or inductive reasoning, if those read just probabilistic conclusions, then doesn't it seem to be a problem? Pay attention carefully here, if you're not already there. Doesn't it seem to be a problem that the premises of those deductive arguments that yield certain conclusions, don't those premises seem to be based on what? Inductive reasoning? Think about that for a moment. So let's go back to our standard example of Socrates. All men are mortal. Socrates is mortal, therefore, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But wait a minute. How do we know that all men are mortal? Well, it seems that we know that all men are mortal based on observation, meaning that, go think about our Doug example. You saw this man and he died, hence mortal, just is what it means to be mortal. You saw this man and he died. You saw this man, he dies. This man, he dies. Your father, your grandfather, whoever. You repeated observation of man after man after man after man, human after human after human after human. Throughout the centuries, even in your own life, you've seen this. Now, that's induction, right? You've come to that conclusion after having observed time after time after time this certain scenario that takes place in regards to men and death, humans and death, namely that it happens. Now, does it yield for certain? Is it certain that all men are mortal based on observation? Well, no, it's not certain, right? Why? Well, because you just logically speaking, we just don't know unless something else is happening, and we'll get to this in a second. But logically speaking, we just don't know for certain in the certain sense, like mathematical certainty or logical certainty. Now, again, to point something out important first is that, remember though, is it probable? Yes, we can easily say by this time, with as many observations that we've made in regards to humanity and their life expectancy, just namely that it's limited, that it's still vastly more probable that humanity, men or women and whatnot, are mortal, or in other words, that they eventually die. We eventually die. That is obviously much more probable than, well, maybe you won't, or some child you see walking on the road, granting that he's actually human, just maybe won't somehow. So this is where Geisler, and if we were going to go ahead and jump ahead in the text here, this would just be, we would be jumping over to page 134, where it just talks about certainty, the nature of probable conclusions, meaning the degrees of probability. That's where we would go ahead and jump over to that. Now, well, actually, too, you could even jump over to page 138 to see the kinds of certainty as well at the very bottom of page 138. And they just highlight, mathematical certainty, which is something like, you've guessed it, mathematics. For instance, 1 plus 1 always equals 2, that sort of thing. Now, then they go and talk about logical certainty, all those sorts of things. Now, I want to speak about something, again, this is going to be more philosophical because we're coming at this from the Aristotelian angle. And this is, again, what I said I wanted to speak a little on here, is that, before we kind of just look at some of the examples in our textbook about probability and how that works. Now, it's slightly hard to unpack this if you don't have any familiarity with Aristotelian or Thomistic metaphysics. Now, induction, it seems like, well, if all we have are these observations, then we really aren't justified at all in drawing any type of conclusion other than probability. But simply coming to these conclusions just for the sake of probability seems to be something, doesn't seem to be very satisfying. It almost sounds like a euphemism for just a really good guess. Unless, and here's the key, unless something like the Aristotelian Thomistic understanding of metaphysics is true. Now, the reason that we're in this mess, so to speak, about induction and about it being only probable and really, as I said earlier, there's no quote unquote logical connection, is because, and to oversimplify here, during the Enlightenment era of philosophy, philosophers came along and they denied the traditional understanding or the classical conception of philosophy that taught that things had a nature and an essence to them. Meaning that dogness is what makes a dog a dog. It's just the nature of a dog, or humanness, the formal cause, as it were, if we're talking about Aristotelian causes, the four causes there, the efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause. The formal cause just is the nature or the essence of the thing itself, like treeness or dogness or humanness. Or again, I'm literally just looking around and seeing things and picking out those, what we would consider to be the nature or the essence of the thing. Now you can see why it's so difficult to discuss and literally just in this little aspect of logic here, because this requires an entire course itself in metaphysics. But at least what I'm trying to do is to put the finger on why we don't think this is necessarily a problem, that deductive arguments, because they're supposed to yield certain conclusions, are based on premises that are relying on induction. Now here's why. When we look at mortals, going back to our standard example of Socrates being mortal, if we look at mortals, if we look at man, it seems that we're able to, this is to use the Aristotelian Thomistic jargon here, we're able to abstract, we're able to, and I'm making finger quotes here, we're able to, finger quote, pull out the nature or the essence of the thing in question with enough observation. So the more we come to understand, say, triangles, the more triangles you see, the more triangles you come in contact with, the more triangles that you are provided witness of, the more you learn of them. You start to understand, you start to, again, pull out or abstract the nature, the essence of what it just means to be a triangle. Well, if it's possible that there's this immaterial, non-material, to put it another way, non-material, real, quote unquote, theme that you've abstracted from, say, triangles or trees or dogs or humans or whatnot, then you've started to understand, just, again, by nature of what it is, you've understood what we would call properties of that thing, or essential properties, or as the old jargon would be there, accidental properties, meaning that things that are just an essential aspect of what the nature of the thing is in and of itself. So if, by observing man after 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 man, if after all of these observations you start to abstract or pull out that part of the nature of man is that it is a mortal thing, that's just part of what the nature of the man is, well, then you're not, like we said earlier, making a quote unquote really good guess. Why? Because you actually understand the nature of the thing. Now, which in this case would be just that they are mortal, that men just are mortal. That's just an essential property of, or an accidental property of, what it means to be a contingent thing, in this case, man, that it doesn't possess immortality. Now, of course, Aquinas would say that we can't even perfectly understand the nature of a fly, a common housefly. And I think that's right. I think there's something humble in that. But that's not to say, again, Aquinas is not saying that we can't understand the nature or essence of things, just that it's difficult, that it's obviously at times more difficult than others. But needless to say that it's not just an exercise in futility, that we don't know anything at all, and the other extreme, that we can perfectly, absolutely understand the nature and essence of something. But again, that doesn't mean that we can't understand something of the essence and the nature of things. This is why we're constantly looking for more observation, more examples, trying to figure quote unquote things out. But the point being, the reason I wanted to sit on that so long is because if, again, to take the standard example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that even though that first premise and even the second premise, even though those are based off inductive, that's an inductive type reasoning process there. If you're able to abstract and pull up the nature of the essence of a thing, then it's not guesswork. It's not the same as just watching the ducks walk through the living room door, and then basically just, guessing that the next that walks through the door will also be just a white duck. It's not so arbitrary as that. Let me say that again. If you're able to abstract the nature and the essence of a thing so that you're actually knowing part of what it just means for the thing to be the thing itself, then it's not like you just watching, even if it's millions of ducks walk through the living room door of one particular color, and then just based off of something like that the next one will probably be the same, have the same color. Because again, that does seem to be just arbitrary or again, to strip away any sort of euphemism, just a really good guess. And that's all you have. Again, if you can abstract the nature and essence, you're not just guessing. You really are coming closer to a true apprehension of the thing in itself, whatever that thing is, in this case, mortals. So hopefully that wasn't too much there. I mean, I know that that's a whole lot in the context of just this logic course, because again, that should have its entire course just in and of itself, which would be just metaphysics, which is just the study of being, what it is, so to speak. Now, having said that, having kind of cleared the way and answered, what might be something of an objection there, let's go back to our text and flip through and just highlight some of these things here. So again, on page 134, and so now, having said that, you can see how these what Geisler and Brooks here are saying, it still applies here, right? It's still applicable to to that whole spiel we just went on there. It's still applicable, but maybe it helps you to understand it in a different light. So on page 134, it says the nature of probable conclusions. Yes, it is probable. It still is a probable conclusion, say something like that all mortals die, but it's not probable in the same way, again, like rolling dice or watching ducks walk through the living room there. But again, just the nature of what it means to be inductive in inductive reasoning process, your conclusions aren't certain in the same sense as a deductive argument, because again, it's always quote unquote logically possible that you've missed something there, right? Now, they spend a great deal of time, 136 on 135 on, basically showing how to arrive at the best possible conclusions when you are using inductive logic or inductive reasoning. So they talk about, the mean, the mode, the median, especially when you're talking about numbers, something in that regard. Now, but on page 137, it really talks about, again, if you want to think about our standard example of Socrates and that whole deductive syllogism, think of that in light of what we're saying here on page 137. How many cases were examined? This is when numbers aren't involved. This is just your regular process, basically how you live your life on an everyday basis when you're making observations and trying to draw conclusions from those observations. So you need to ask yourself these types of questions. This is very good here in 137. How many cases were examined? Meaning, have you come to the belief that men are mortal because you saw one man die, right? Or is it because you've seen many cases over and over and over, even centuries, a century's worth or centuries worth of cases of what it looks like it means to be a man, or the lifespan and so on. Now, the other is how representative is the evidence. So meaning that you weren't just looking at, say, Brazilian men, right? You were looking at Brazilian men, Guatemalan men, North American men, South American men, American Indians, Scotsmen, people from Asia, meaning that it wasn't just men over many centuries, but all races and classes and groups and all this sort of thing. How carefully was the evidence examined? Were they really dead, right? Are they really dead? Things like that. And these are just good questions, again, to keep in mind when we are making some sort of observation, because again, this is just how we live on a day-to-day basis. We don't start out normally with deductive reasoning. We start out with inductive reasoning. Again, this is usually going to be our premises for our deductive arguments are almost always going to be based on what we use on a day-to-day type basis, which is the inductive method of reasoning. Now, these are also, just in case you're involved in statistical analyses and things like that, these are very important questions to keep in mind if you're doing such a thing. But they're also very important questions to keep in mind when you're reading the conclusions from those who have done statistical analyses, especially in light of, say, for instance, right now we're in as of this recording, we're in a political season with polls showing numbers for who's supposed to vote for who and who's going to win, this or that election. Well, ask the question, all right, this polling data, how many cases were examined? How representative is the evidence? Did they poll people from a wide range of demographics, socioeconomic backgrounds, and so on and so forth? Or is it very limited in scope? And then how carefully was the evidence examined? Now, that question, how carefully was the evidence examined, really comes into play with, the old saying, correlation that we love in philosophy. Correlation does not entail causation. There's a wonderful little web link. You could probably Google this and find it, that shows all sorts of odd correlations, but that have gone on for years. And not just odd, I mean silly correlations that have gone on for years. Things like literally how much cheese was consumed in the United States correlates perfectly with how many movies Nicolas Cage made an appearance in, something like that. Just weird and goofy correlations, but that have gone on for years, but clearly there's no causal relationship there. They're just correlating for whatever reason. One is even something like something weird, and then people that die by being tangled up in their bed sheet. Try to Google that. It's hilarious. It's worth the time. But anyway, that's the sort of questions that you want to keep in mind when you're looking at those sorts of things, but also just on your everyday basis when you're making observations and trying to come to conclusions. Now, if you flip to page 138, and it talks about kinds of certainty. Again, this is the sort of thing that we talked about a minute ago, that when we, there's a difference between mathematical certainty and logical certainty. Something like you can be logically certain that bachelors really are unmarried males because the predicate, literally just contains, or let me say it this way, the subject just contains the truth of what the predicate says in itself already. So as you continue to look down through there, it just talks about the kinds of certainty that we have. And again, almost all of this is just based on, again, what kind of reasoning? Inductive type reasoning. And then what they really want to talk about too, at the bottom of that is the reasonableness of these particular types of certainty. Now, again, and then he goes into moral certainty on page 140. And again, all of these particular things are pretty nicely explained here in the text that we don't necessarily have to jump into. What they're really starting to touch into on page 140 at the bottom is going to get into not necessarily Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem is how you add in all of these sorts of effects and causes and data points it's a very complicated mathematical, not equation, but formula that works with how you put in data, how do you see how this relates to the surrounding evidence and so on and so forth. But this is similar to that when it helps to tell you how to evaluate certain claims in light of inductive reasoning as far as probability goes. How probable is this particular conclusion when you can use these sorts of methods to go through that? It talks about dice here. It talks about exclusive events. It talks about a priori and a posteriori probability. And then it gives the distinctions there. A priori, of course, just means on the face of it or before it's prior to any sort of examination, which would be what? Like mathematical, independent of events, logical, statistical. And then a posteriori, after the experience, meaning things we come to learn after observation, after empirical type investigation, would be dependent on events. It'd be scientific type reasoning. It'd be experimental type reasoning. Now, you can go through here and look at these, essentially just these equations and formulas. In fact, you'll have to for your end quiz at the end of the chapter here. It's not too difficult, and you should be familiar with this. But what I really want you to be concerned with, what I really want you to take away from this, is what it means to do inductive type reasoning, especially what it means to do inductive type reasoning in light of the Aristotelian Thomistic school of thought philosophically. That metaphysical stance, meaning that when you're doing inductive reasoning, the mind, just by the way that it's made or created, is going to be able to abstract, pull out the nature and essence of things, so that we're not just making, high mathematical guesses and whatnot. And the reason I want us to be able to pay attention to that and really be familiar with what we mean when we say inductive type reasoning is really going to come into play with the next chapter, because the next chapter, scientific type thinking and the methodology of science is going to rely highly, in fact, almost exclusively, and it's key we say almost, but almost exclusively on the inductive type method. So it's odd here because philosophically, skeptics really want to say that there's a problem with inductive reasoning, of course, notably David Hume. But they want to say that there's a problem in inductive reasoning. However, most skeptics always want to put large amounts of faith in science as opposed to, say, philosophical inquiry or religious type inquiry, those types of things. However, what they've done, if they really want to flush or get rid of inductive reasoning as some sort of as fallacious or ridiculous or invaluable, then they're also simultaneously going to be destroying science, because science relies so heavily on the inductive reasoning process, observation, over and over and over, these experiments that we do. And again, we'll go into that next chapter, but suffice to say for now, be familiar with some of the mathematical little exercises there they go through in regards to inductive reasoning. But the big takeaway is just, again, familiar with the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning, and that if something like the classical conception of the Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysic is true, which I'm convinced it is, obviously, then inductive reasoning comes part and parcel with us and our ability to abstract the natures and essences of things. See you next time.